Hello, dear friends and colleagues. Welcome to the Netherlands Institute at Athens, and thank you for being here with us today, in person and online, to the second lecture of the annual series Byzantine Talks NIA. Also, we thank you on behalf of our NIA director, Professor Dr. Anne Brisberg, who could not join us today due to professional reasons. But tonight we have our Deputy Director with us, Dr. S. Willem Ledeboer, and we thank him very much for that. Also, we want to thank the wife of the late Professor, Vasiliki Leontaritou Troianou, for being with us today as well. Now, for those who that join us for the first time, we want to inform you that the series is dedicated to the memory of Professor Spyros Troianos. The late professor was very generous and donated the core of his personal book collection, which is related to Byzantine law and Byzantine culture, to the Netherlands Institute at Athens. The establishment of this series was the least we could do to express our gratitude, because what he donated to NIA cannot be enough emphasized. The aim of this activity is to show the attention that the NIA has invested in the Byzantine collection of its library, and also to give the Byzantinologists within Greece and other countries the chance to meet at the NIA, exchange opinions on the field, and create the environment for fruitful dialogue and scientific collaboration between the NIA, the international academic community, and the interested audience in Greece. Going back to the donation, there were people and organizations that contributed in many ways to complete this project, and some of them still do. Among them is the association Chronics Rechte Stories Fonds, which contributed once again this year by donating an amount of money to the NIA for the binding project that is related to books of the Troianos collection, and we cordially thank them for their important contribution. Another person that has helped us a lot and still does is our today's speaker, Dr. Marios Tantalos, who is always willing to provide assistance whenever we need it. So thank you very much, Dr. Tantalos, for your contribution to the Troianos collection and for accepting the invitation for this year's lecture and collaboration. Also, we want to thank Dr. Ilias Arnaoutoglou, who will be the moderator of today's lecture. So now it's the time to introduce them to you, and I will start with Dr. Tantalos. Marios Tantalos is a lecturer at the Department of Legal History of the University of Athens. He studied history and law at the University of Athens, where he defended his thesis on possession and its protection in the late Roman and Byzantine law. He has been an external research assistant at the research program run by the Academy of Gedegend, entitled Edition und Bearbeitung Byzantinische Rechtsquellen, and directed by Professor Simon. In 2019, he was granted a scholarship of the Gerta Henkel Stiftung for a postdoc research at the University of Groningen. It was the years 2019 until 2021. His research focused on Byzantine and post-Byzantine law. Dr. Ilias Arnaoutoglou is Director of Research at the Research Center for the History of Greek Law at the Academy of Athens since 2000. He graduated from the Faculty of Law in Thessaloniki, where he also completed a postgraduate course on Greek legal history. He studied with D.M. McDowell for a PhD in Classics and Ancient History, awarded in 1993 from the University of Glasgow. He has been assistant editor in the Oxford-based project, sponsored by the British Academy, the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names, from 1994 until 1999. He has published extensively on private associations, edited several entries for the Copenhagen Association project since 2012, and commented on various legal epigraphic testimonia. He has also contributed to the preparation of the new edition of the Historical Outline of Post-Byzantine Law, and more recently edited an anthology of Greek legal documents from early Arabic Egypt. Now it's time to start the lecture. So, Dr. Tantalos, the floor is yours.
First of all, I would like to thank the director of the Netherlands Institute of Athens for the invitation and all the personnel of the Institute for their assistance. It is a great honor for me to give this lecture on this series of lectures dedicated to the memory of Professor Spyros Troianos. Spyros Troianos was not just a beloved teacher, he was an exceptional figure. I had always the sense that he filled the space with wisdom and wit, and I do have the very same feeling every time I enter his library upstairs. So, according to a according to a contemporary testimony, it is reported that toward the end of the 18th century, the notorious thief Zacharias Barbaritsas was particularly admired for the way he administered justice, drawing upon the Hexabiblos as his legal reference. Remarkably, he did so within a self-established magistrates' court situated in his own territory in the Peloponnesus. The fact that he was entirely illiterate did not appear to hinder him from consulting the Hexabiblos and performing his judicial functions. A few decades later, in 1830, the renowned French historian Edgar Quinet, in his La Grèce moderne, recounts that the village mayor in the Peloponnesus similarly relied on the Hexabiblos to guide his judicial decisions. What particularly stresses Quinet was the fact that the local governor had the book firmly in his hands throughout the proceedings, yet never once one saw him opening it. While we cannot entirely dismiss the possibility that a man without formal legal training may have memorized and could proficiently navigate a 400-page legal text, it becomes evident that in both cases, the Hexabiblos functioned as a symbolic, as a magical object. In these above-mentioned instances, the physical presence of the Hexabiblos served to legitimize, impose, and lend prestige to otherwise arbitrary judgments rendered by those who held it. The book, imbued with authority, operated as a judicial icon, one that inspired deference and conveyed a sense of legal continuity and legitimacy. After all, this is the same holy Hexabiblos of the holy Arnaoutoglou, as it is frequently referred to in numerous documents issued by the Chancellery of the Patriarchate of Constantinople throughout the Ottoman period following the fall in 1453. This raises the fundamental question: how did a legal compendium authored by a humble provincial judge come to attain such prominence in the southeastern part of Europe, remaining in active use for more than 4 centuries after its composition? As is well known, Konstantinos Armenopoulos was a judge who lived in Thessaloniki around the mid-14th century. Biographical information about him is scarce. The first known reference to his name appears in 1345, when he signed a judicial document in his capacity as local Catholicos Kritis of Thessaloniki. Around that time, he compiled the Hexabiblos, a legal manual consisting of 6 books based entirely on earlier Byzantine legal sources. His objective was to create a handbook that would be readily accessible and practically useful to his fellow judges. This intent is clearly reflected in the work's original title, Πρόχειρος νόμος, literally handy law. His aim was not merely to replace the earlier Πρόχειρος νόμος of the 9th century, but also to provide his colleagues with a more complete and systematic legal guide. It should be thus stressed that the Hexabiblos was not the product of a scholarly committee. It was not commissioned by imperial authority, nor was it enacted as law through legislative means. Nevertheless, it came to function as law in practice precisely because of its clarity, comprehensiveness, and ease of reference. The popularity of the Hexabiblos can largely be attributed to the nature of the text itself. Arnaoutoglou organized civil law in a radically different manner than previous legal sources, dividing it into five main parts. A, general principles. B, property law. C, the law of obligations. D, family law. And E, the law of succession. Moreover, the Hexabiblos included most of the fundamental regulations of Byzantine law, which, at its core, is Roman law, making it an ideal legal compendium, which was widely applied in the East shortly after its completion in 1345, especially by Byzantine judges and the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Somewhat surprisingly, it also found use in the West. As is well known, a continuous tradition of legal scholarship began in medieval Europe, especially in Bologna, a university founded amid the power struggle between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, and during the economic rise of northern Italian cities. Around 1100, Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis became the fundamental text for legal education at the Studium of Bologna. This tradition of legal education spread throughout Europe and remains unbroken to this day. For centuries, Roman legal texts were at the heart of the legal curriculum. The scholastic method, formal logic applied to authoritative texts, was the prevailing approach. Just as theologians interpreted the Bible, jurists against with the Corpus Juris, seeking to read it as a coherent whole. This required harmonizing contradictory texts that offer different solutions to similar legal issues. In this context, the Hexabiblos, with its clear structure and rich content, became a valuable tool for legal interpretation. The Hexabiblos' career in Western Europe was greatly aided by its early printing in 1540. Its first editor has long been misidentified as Arnaoutoglou de Zwanenberg, a confusion arising from mistaking his place of origin in northern Rhineland-Westphalia for his surname. This error relegated him to a somewhat mysterious figure in the history of Byzantine legal scholarship. As the late Professor Spyros, who was instrumental in reviving modern interest in the Hexabiblos, noted 25 years ago, we know nothing about the first editor of the Hexabiblos, except what he tells us in his preface of the book, namely that he was professor at the University of Paris. While this may be true of Arnaoutoglou de Zwanenberg, it does not apply to Theodoricus Adameus. Born in 1470, Adameus authored a series of predominantly geographical scholia on Procopius de Edificis, drawing from sources such as Ptolemy, Strabo, Pliny, Ammianus Marcellinus, Agathias, and most significantly Stephanus of Byzantium, the 6th century author of the Ethnica. His commentary was published in Paris in 1537. Abraham Ortelius, the renowned geographer, cosmographer, and creator of the first modern atlas, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, cites Adameus' work in his Synonymia and refers to him 8 times in his Thesaurus. Adameus' earlier published work appears to be a panegyrical discourse addressed to Charles V of France, titled Christiani Orbis Concordia, Panegyricus Gratulatorius ad Carolum Quinquidum, published in Paris in 1532. He also issued an edition of the Pinax, attributed to Civis, a philosopher from Thebes and disciple of Socrates, though now generally believed to be the work of a pseudonymous author from the 1st or 2nd century. The work that likely sparked Adameus' interest in the Hexabiblos was the Insula Rhodo et Militarium Ordinum Institutione, edited by him in Paris in 1536. It addresses the 1522 Ottoman siege of Rhodes and the defeat of the Knights of St. John. It is possible that Adameus was drawn to the Lex Rhodia, the Rhodian law requiring shared responsibility among consignors and shipmasters for maritime losses, and turned to Byzantine legal sources to explore its function and application. Adameus' edition of the Hexabiblos is marred by numerous errors, including frequent misspellings and misreadings of the text. It disregards the extensive manuscript tradition of the text, which includes approximately 70 known witnesses. His edition relies solely on a single manuscript, identified by the late Professor Marie-Thérèse Veugen as the Parisinus Graecus 1386. This earliest printed edition simply reproduces exactly the manuscript that served as printer's copy, without even an elementary attempt at correction by its editor. It is therefore an apocryph of the Parisinus manuscript. The Greek text of the Hexabiblos was translated into Latin in 1547 in Cologne by Bernard von Rey, and again in 1556 in Lyon by Johannes Mercerus, a French professor of Hebrew at the Collège Royal. A German translation followed in 1564 by Justinus Göbler, a prominent jurist from St. Goar, and was published in Frankfurt. This translation was reprinted in 1566 and again in 1576, indicating its popularity in German legal circles. In his preface, Göbler states that his translation was intended for the common benefit, specifically for readers whose Latin and Greek, I would add, skills were insufficient to engage with the original. The second printed edition of the Hexabiblos is credited to the French jurist Denis Godefroy, a member of the distinguished Godefroy family. Published in Geneva in 1587, Godefroy's edition was part of a broader scholarly project. Born in Paris, Godefroy studied law in Louvain, Cologne, and Heidelberg, returning to Paris in 1573. After embracing the Reformed faith, he left Paris in 1579, despite the promise of a brilliant legal career, and settled in Geneva, where he became professor of law and in 1587 a member of the Council of the 200. In 1591, he was appointed professor of Roman law at Strasbourg, remaining there until 600, when he relocated to Heidelberg. He died in Strasbourg in 1622, having left Heidelberg before its sacking by imperial troops in 1621. Godefroy's most significant contribution to legal scholarship was his edition of the Corpus Juris Civilis, first published in Geneva in 1583. His editions of Byzantine legal texts, including the Hexabiblos, represent a smaller but notable part of his scholarly output. In his preface to his edition of the Hexabiblos, Godefroy justifies the work's publication because of its practical utility and legal historical value. He articulates a vision of a universal divine law as the common origin of all national legal systems, systems that have diverged over time. According to Godefroy, the law compiled in the Hexabiblos is not only relevant to the Byzantine tradition, but is also linked to the legal heritage of Central Europe and therefore deserves scholarly attention. The second edition of the Hexabiblos by Dionysios Godofredous is not original in the strict sense. Rather than producing a new text, he collated Adameus' Greek edition with Mercier's Johannes Mercerus, Latin translation, introduced some corrections, and added varie lectiones from an unidentified manuscript once owned by the Swiss jurist and philologist Jacques Lecht. Yet, Godofredus' work, with its rich marginalia, explanatory commentary, cross-references to other Byzantine legal sources, index of the words and material at the end of the edition, is a typical example of the new methodological approach to legal texts known as legal humanism. Legal humanism is an expression generally used to refer to the study of Roman law by 16th century philologists. It was inspired by the general spirit of inquisitiveness and no longer taking things for granted that ended the Middle Ages. It is characterized by a strong interest in classical antiquity and a desire to engage with it directly through original sources. Rather than merely studying the legal texts, the humanists also explored the historical and linguistic contexts. Emerging a century and a half after what is taken to be the birth of humanism, it is generally considered part of the humanist movement, primarily due to its focus on the historical interpretation of Latin texts. Within the field of legal history, legal humanism has a very precise technical significance. It refers to the school of thought active in the 16th century, particularly in France, which applied historical and philological methods to understanding the sources of Roman law that had survived from antiquity. It is also often taken to apply to the scholars who continued to practice this branch of legal scholarship, particularly in the Netherlands, in the 17th and 18th centuries. The founders of legal humanism published their first works in the opening 2 decades of the 16th century. The center of gravity was the University of Bourges in the mid-16th century, where a succession of famous names among legal humanists, Balduinus, Donellus, and above all, Kouliakius taught at some point. Roman law in the Renaissance, however, carries an entirely different connotation for the legal historian as the Renaissance of Roman law. The latter can only refer to the rediscovery and study of the sources of Roman law in the 11th, 12th centuries. The most significant event in European legal history has always been regarded as the recovery of the Latin corpus juris in the 11th century. From the outset, legal humanism represented a shift in how existing ancient sources were used rather than the discovery of classical antiquity. Humanist philology begins in the 14th century, still well within the age of the manuscript book, and its impact can be seen in the contaminated condition of 15th century Latin manuscripts. Humanist scholars and readers began to modify the texts they were reading. They collated manuscripts. They invented the conjecture. The direct acquaintance with the manuscripts gave them practical insight into how corruption occurred during the copying of texts by scribes. One of the defining characteristics of the Renaissance was the recovery of the knowledge of Greek language and literature. Humanists were fascinated by the recovery of the Greek elements in the corpus juris. Roman jurists occasionally quoted Greek literature and legal documents from the Greek-speaking East, and Eastern Roman emperors issued decisions in Greek. During the Middle Ages, much of this Greek material was lost due to limited knowledge of the Greek language. Renaissance humanists worked to restore these Greek elements by studying early manuscripts and conjecturing, or by seeking out the early manuscripts that still had traces of the Greek. Even more significant for legal humanism was the discovery of Byzantine law. Already in the lifetime of Justinian, the knowledge of Latin at Constantinople was tenuous. Like the corpus juris of Justinian, Byzantine legal sources are epitomes or sendos of earlier Latin legal texts with additions woven into the text. The combinatorial character of Byzantine legal texts influenced subsequent developments in the law of the Byzantine Empire, and it was exactly what rendered the Byzantine legal works of interest to the humanists. Underlying these developments, they could detect, by peering below the encastration of later ages, the original Latin works of Roman law. By back-translating these Byzantine texts into Latin and comparing them with Roman legal sources, humanists gained valuable insights for interpreting and critiquing Roman law. Beginning in the 16th century, many of these Byzantine legal sources were rediscovered and edited by humanist scholars. For the humanists, the Latin text was no longer viewed as a unified codification of law in which all contradictions had to be resolved by legal reasoning. It became evident that legal texts had been written in different historical periods by different jurists. This realization explained the so-called apparent contradictions in the digest. They were not, in fact, apparent, but real. Now it could be seen that texts were written in a context other than that in which they were now being cited. This insight emerged from the restoration of the digest's inscriptions. Humanists also realized that the Latin legal texts were corrupt. Different manuscripts contained different readings. Manuscripts were compared, and the newly discovered Byzantine sources were consulted to determine the likely original Latin text. And even where no variant was forthcoming from these sources, the text might still be deemed corrupt and in need of emendation using the new humanist invention of the textual conjecture. According to the legal humanists, legal texts were also interpolated, that is, deliberately altered by Justinian's compilers to bring them up to date many centuries after they were written. With the humanist discovery and editing of classical sources, transmitted independently of Justinian codification, it was possible to directly compare the same passages. The most remarkable example of how Armenopoulos' legacy endured in Western intellectual life appears in a theatrical act by Jean Racine, one of the most prominent French dramatists of the 17th century. In his 1668 comedy Le Plaider de Litigants, a lawyer named Lantimet supports his case by invoking major legal authorities, including Aristotle, Jacques Cousin, and, quite surprisingly, Armenopoulos and his Hexabiblos. The second phase of the legal humanism emerged prominently again in the Republic of the Netherlands between roughly 1670 and 1730. The young, prosperous republic attracted scholars from across Europe thanks to the high academic level of its antiquarian approach to Roman legal sources, known as the Dutch Elegant School. This new flavor of legal humanism reached its peak with the Dutch jurists of the 17th and 18th centuries, who brought fresh insights to the examination of Roman sources and developed innovative ways to the study and synthesis of local customary law within a classical Roman framework. The flowering of Dutch scholarship and its prominence in European legal culture went hand in hand with the expansion of Dutch economic and political power in Europe and abroad. It is therefore no wonder that the next third edition of the Hexabiblos was predominantly a Dutch case, and thanks to the studies of Professor Daphne Pena, we can track down the progress towards its completion. The first Dutch scholar to show an interest in editing the Hexabiblos was Abraham Haverkamp, professor of Greek at the University of Leiden. His 1738 doctoral thesis focuses on a fragment of the Hexabiblos, as the title Specimen Juridicum ad Konstantinos Armenopoulos indicates. Haverkamp's admiration for Armenopoulos is evident in how he refers to him. Ad Constantinum Nostrum and Noster Armenopoulos, a Latin honorific title also used in Roman legal texts, such as Gaius Noster in Justinian's legislation. Cousin similarly refers to Theophilus and Accursius as Theophilus Noster and Accursius Noster. An amusing moment in Haverkamp's thesis occurs when he directly addresses Armenopoulos in the second person, praising his work. Despite this admiration, Haverkamp soon abandoned his plan to publish a new edition of the Hexabiblos. The next scholar to pursue the Hexabiblos was David Runkenius, a key figure of the Dutch school of elegant jurisprudence. Born in Germany, Runkenius initially studied mathematics and Roman law at the University of Wittenberg, but left for Leiden in 1744 to study Greek literature, Leiden being the only true center for Greek scholarship on the continent at the time. He became lecturer in Greek in 1757 and was appointed full professor of history 4 years later. A likely catalyst for Runkenius' interest in the Hexabiblos was the Leiden Library's copy of Adameus' first edition, previously owned and annotated by Gerard Valkenburg, a Dutch humanist, former student of Jacques Cousin, and first editor of the Dionysiaca by Nonnus of Panopolis. The third printed edition of the Hexabiblos was finally completed by Otto Wilhelm Reitz, a Latin teacher and rector of the Latin school in Middelburg, Zeeland. Reitz had prior experience with Byzantine legal texts, having edited Theophilus' Paraphrases, a Greek version of Justinian Institutes, published in the Hague in 1751, as well as 4 books of the Basilica. Reitz based his edition on 2 manuscripts, Codex Mermanus A and B. The first, known today as Berolinensis 93, is housed in the Berlin State Library. The traces of the other have since been lost. In addition to the manuscripts, Reitz incorporated a wealth of supplementary material, which he meticulously catalogued in his preface. Annotated editions of earlier printings owned by Falkenburg, Leconte, and Haverkamp, along with scholarly notes and conjectures from Scaliger, Pennas, Marios, and others. Reitz also produced a new Latin translation of the Greek text, placed in parallel columns. His critical apparatus includes scholia, referencing other legal sources, comparisons with earlier annotations, and a variety of philological and historical insights, a distinctly humanistic approach to editing the text. Whereas in Western Europe, the Hexabiblos is edited and published in printed books, in the eastern part of Europe, under Ottoman and Latin rule, it was transmitted primarily through manuscripts. In the present lecture, we shall set aside the reception of the Hexabiblos in the Slavic world and its translations in Slavic languages, as this constitutes a separate chapter of its tradition. What is more interesting is the scholar's attempt to paraphrase, that is, to reword and interpret its original text from Byzantine into vernacular Greek. This technique was essential for making the text accessible to a broader audience, as Byzantine Greek was largely incomprehensible by most of the literate people in the post-Byzantine period due to the decline of the educational attainment level. The first known and complete paraphrases of the Hexabiblos that has survived to our time is transmitted in at least 3 manuscripts, namely Petropolitanus 139, Parisinus Graecus Supplementum 1239, and Center of Neo-Hellenic Research, National Hellenic Research Foundation number 11. It was written before 1605 by Theodosios Zygomalas, son of Ioannis Zygomalas, a high official at the Patriarchate of Constantinople, originating from Nafplion. Theodosios was born around 1544 and followed his father to Constantinople around 1555. He too rose to high office within the Patriarchate, serving first as notarios, later as protonotarios, and towards the end of his life as Dikeophylax. He probably died shortly after 1605, perhaps in the Great Plague of 1607. Theodosios Zygomalas, referred to already at the beginning of the 18th century as Dokimos Anir και Sophos, erudite and wise man, is also known for his paraphrase of the so-called Synopsis Minor, a compilation of legal principles arranged in alphabetical order, dating from the end of the 13th century and edited by Professor Stavros Perentidis in 1985. The paraphrases of the Hexabiblos by Theodosios Zygomalas remains unpublished. However, an edition of the text is under preparation by Senior Director of Research of the National Hellenic Research Foundation, Dimitrios Apostolopoulos, and Professor Stavros Perentidis. The second complete paraphrases of the Hexabiblos, known to us, is preserved in at least 3 manuscripts, Batopedi Graecus 26, Parisinus Graecus 1363a, Sinaiticus Graecus 1603. It was completed before 1671, most likely in the monastery of Vatopedi. This paraphrasis, which remains unpublished, appears to follow the text of the Hexabiblos very closely. The original source, whether manuscript or printed edition, from which the paraphrasis derives, has not yet been identified. By contrast, the source text of the third paraphrasis of the Hexabiblos under examination can be identified with certainty. It is the Greco-Latin edition of the Hexabiblos by Dionysios Godofredous, published, as we have seen, in Geneva in 1587. It is evident that the anonymous translator displays little knowledge in legal matters, nor is he a law practitioner, since he has difficulties in understanding the legal terminology. Apart from the interest that this paraphrasis presents for the history of legal science and the transmission of reception of the work of Konstantinos Armenopoulos, is also of considerable value as linguistic source, especially since it seems to have been composed in the late 17th, early 18th century, a period for which evidence is scant. It is of special value to lexicography, as it covers semantic fields not commonly to be met within other textual genres, for example, legal terminology. Indeed, the anonymous translator shows a remarkable ability to the use of the words. His vocabulary is rich of words of the common everyday speech or loan words of Turkish origin. What is also very interesting is that in his effort to make the text of the Hexabiblos apprehensible, he resorts to the Latin translation of the edition by Godofredous, and he uses words from the Latin text to render the legal vocabulary. In order to give a more concrete picture of the language described, I have highlighted here some samples of the text in comparison to the text of the edition of Godofredous. The text is transmitted in two manuscripts, Byzantine number 5 and Lycio Mytilenes 51, and its edition is under preparation by the Senior Director of Research of the National Hellenic Research Foundation, Machi Pais Apostolopoulou, Dimitris Apostolopoulos, and the speaker. The fourth paraphrasis of the text of the Hexabiblos is the well-known translation in vernacular Greek by the philologist Alexios Panos, printed in Venice in 1744. The book was reprinted at least 6 times until 1820, and it represents the strongest testimony of how popular the Hexabiblos was in the Greek-speaking world of the 18th century. It is true that the early history of Byzantine studies is often characterized as a history of absence, in the sense that the Byzantine world was absent altogether from the intellectual enterprises, scientific discoveries, scholarly debates, and cultural movements that shaped early modern Europe. Its absence in scholarship on the intellectual and cultural history of the early modern West has reinforced the view that Byzantium remained marginal to the manifold currents of the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment. We tend to approach the history of the discipline between 1450 and 1900 as a progression through 4 broad stages. 1, humanist indifference. 2, Baroque enthusiasm. 3, Enlightenment contempt. And finally, 4, 19th century institutionalization. In Ostrogoski's words, for humanists of the 15th and 16th centuries, Byzantium was regarded as the storehouse in which the treasures of the classical world were to be found. The case of the Hexabiblos, however, is clear evidence of how the learned men of the 16th century were specifically interested in Byzantine law. It highlights an example in which scholars have looked back to the Byzantine past as a source not of heresy and vice, but of knowledge and wisdom. Legal humanism did not only contribute to the editing of legal texts, but also to the development from case law to codification. Roman law in its classical form consisted of case law, a characteristic that it notably shares with modern common law. Both Justinian's Code and his Digest are collections of solutions to specific legal cases. During the Middle Ages and later on, jurists began to study Roman law in such a way that eventually led to the civil law systems we know today. A key contributing factor to this evolution can be traced back to the medieval Sume, where titles of the Corpus Juris Civilis are treated in a systematic way. By grouping together consistent and contrasting texts around the sedes materiae, made it easier to find the general rules and principles that were hidden behind the solutions to the cases. Eventually, this made possible the construction of systematic codifications of private law, in which a large amount of Roman law has found a place. Byzantine legal texts, and above all the Hexabiblos with its revolutionary structure, appears to have played a significant role in this evolution. The full story of the Hexabiblos reception in Western Europe has yet to be told. Numerous annotated exemplars and prints of the Hexabiblos in the European libraries and worldwide, not to mention private collections, still await study, registration, comparison, and attribution to their previous holders, many of whom belonged to the circle of legal humanists. More significantly, 680 years after its completion, although it received legal force in the newly founded Kingdom of Greece until 1946, we still lack a reliable critical edition of the Hexabiblos. The current critical edition, produced by Gustav Ernst Haibach and printed in Germany in 1851, is weighed down by scholia and passages added in augmented versions of the Hexabiblos, and clearly fails to render the original text of Konstantinos Armenopoulos. The minimal requirements for undertaking the task of editing the text of the Hexabiblos, that is, a survey of the available textual witnesses, reasons for using some rather than others, collation of the manuscripts with the utmost care, classification of them that must be based on their direct reading, should also include the knowledge of the conditions that generated the earlier editions of the Hexabiblos, which are part of its history. After all, nearly 7 centuries after its completion, the Hexabiblos remains still a magical book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario, for this. Thank you very much for these presentations. You gave us instances and specimens of the starting history of Hexabiblos in the European legal South of the 16th, 17th century, but I bet also in the drastic legal libraries of the universities. We have already a question over Zoom. If you have a question here, we can start from the room and people attending here.
Thank you very much, Marios. I would like to ask you if in this proceeding of the humanists to make a critical edition with conjecture and such things, if it is noticed that they corrected the text also in places where would not be corrected. As philologs, produce the better text and not the original text. Because this is a problem.
Yes,
sometimes.
yes, I understand, yes. I think this was the regular, the rule. This was the rule, because they did not based on the problem is that their readings were not based on the manuscript tradition, so they had this tendency to make conjectures on their own, without which were not based on the manuscript tradition, the textual witnesses. And the other thing is that, of course, Arnaoutoglou, it doesn't, the Hexabiblos, which compilatorial work, often Arnaoutoglou uses sources that are somehow corrupted. So it wouldn't be nice to make conjectures to this text, because Arnaoutoglou could have used a corrupted text, I mean, which is not based on the textual witnesses, on manuscripts.
Anyone else? Professor Kolias?
Ελπίζω ότι οι εξ αποστάσεως παρακολουθούντες γνωρίζουν την ελληνική. Δεν θυμάμαι, αναφέρατε αν εργάζεστε σε έκδοση του Αρμενόπουλου. Δηλαδή, πρόκειται για μία ανακοίνωση στο πλαίσιο μιας προσπάθειας για έκδοση.
Υπάρχει μια προσπάθεια, αλλά ακόμα είναι πολύ προκαταρκτικό στάδιο. Ναι, έχουμε μαζέψει τα χειρόγραφα και αυτά, αλλά είναι προκαταρκτικό.
Μάλιστα. Πολύ ωραία. Ελπίζω θα είναι πολύ χρήσιμο για όλους μας, οπωσδήποτε. Όσον αφορά την αποκατάσταση του κειμένου, αν δεν κάνω λάθος, τον Αρμενόπουλο, την Hexabiblos, την έχουμε και σε άλλες γλώσσες. Δηλαδή, εκτός από τη λατινική, έχει αξιοποιηθεί ως νομικό εγχειρίδιο και από σλαβικές. Ναι. Σε μια τέτοια προσπάθεια για έκδοση θα ήταν, υποθέτω, χρήσιμη η αξιοποίηση και μεταφράσεων, εννοώ μεταφράσεων παλαιότερων, όχι σύγχρονων.
Ναι, πιθανώς.
Και θα μου επιτρέψετε και μία άλλη ερώτηση, μια και πολύ ωραία και έχει πολύ ενδιαφέρον, τώρα παρέλειψα να πω πόσο ενδιαφέρον είχε και πόσο ενδιαφέρον παρακολούθησα. Αναφερθήκατε στην ανθρωπιστική, δηλαδή την προσέγγιση και φιλολογική κατά κάποιο τρόπο. Μία απορία την οποία έχω εγώ από παλιά. Αρναούτογλου. Όταν γράφαμε στα ελληνικά τι πολυτονικό, δεν θυμάμαι κάποιον από τους παλαιούς, τον Άμαντο, τον Ζακηθινό κτλ. Να αναφέρουν τον Αρναούτογλου με δασία. Η ετυμολογία είναι από τον Αρμένη, από την Αρμενία, είναι από το Αρμενίζο. Γιατί έχουμε τώρα, δεν περιμένω κάποια απάντηση, μακάρι να το έχετε ήδη. Εμένα με έχει προβληματίσει και στο παρελθόν. Όταν πάω να γράψω το όνομά του κάποια στιγμή, και σε άλλες γλώσσες, Αρναούτογλος ή Αρναούτογλος θα γράψω σε μια άλλη γλώσσα. Απλώς έτσι, μήπως και από το ακροατήριο κάποιος έχει προβληματιστεί όσον αφορά την δασία ή όχι, το δασία.
Ο Σπιτσάκης πώς το γράφει, αυτός είναι ο κανόνας.
Να σας πω την αλήθεια, όσο άκουγα, προσπάθησα να το βρω στο κινητό μου, αλλά δεν μπόρεσα να δω πώς το... Με ψηλή. Και εγώ νομίζω με ψηλή στα ελληνικά, στα νέα ελληνικά το γράφουμε και θα ήταν μια έτσι ενδιαφέρουσα λεπτομέρεια πώς προέκυψε το «χ», η δασία. Ευχαριστώ.
Ναι, αυτό είναι σωστό.
Κυρία καθηγήτρια Δημοπούλου.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον κύριο Τάνταλο για την πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα συνολική και παράλληλα ευρεία παρουσίαση της πορείας του Αρναούτογλου. Αναφέρατε στο τέλος ότι μένει να γραφτεί η ιστορία της επιρροής στη δυτική πρόσληψη του ρωμαϊκού δικαίου, της επιρροής του Αρναούτογλου. Έχουμε καμία εικόνα εάν στους πρώτους κώδικες, πριν από το κώδικο Ναπολεόν, τον Προσικό, τον Αυστριακό κτλ. Υπάρχει κάποια επιρροή, γιατί ο Γαλλικός, από ό,τι θυμάμαι, ακολουθεί την τριμερή διάκριση του Γαΐου και δικονομία. Στους πρώην θέτες χρονικά έχουμε καμία εικόνα.
Δεν έχω υπόψη μου κάτι, όχι. Αλλά είναι προς διερεύνηση, φαντάζομαι, και αυτό.
Because we have some students who don't understand Greek, so I would like to ask you just to address the question in English or in French, I suppose. Professor Keller.
Thank you for this lecture, very interesting. Just a question about terminology. The word, sorry, I have to, prokatastasis, which is translated by preparatio. We know something about this word, this term, prokatastasis.
Or προκατάταξης.
Προκατάταξης.
No, prokatastasis.
Προκατάστασης.
It was
Ah,
here.
okay.
No, what? At the left. And
Here in the manuscript.
yes,
I don't know. No.
prokatastasis in Greek and preparatio in Latin.
It could be misreading. It could be misreading. Misreading.
Misreading.
Yes. Instead of prokatártaxis, yes.
Ναι, γιατί σήμερα είναι ακριβώς
Προκατάρταξη.
κατάρταξη. Όχι κατάσταση.
Oh no, I think it's misreading. Yes.
And it is preparatio.
Yes, for the reader.
Ναι, όταν είναι προκατάρτισης, English not so good to use the accent. Όταν είναι προκατάρτισης, είναι preparation με την έννοια, Ανδρέα, ότι είναι πρώιμο στάδιο εκμαθήσεως. Πρώτο στάδιο είναι καταρτίζω, καταρτισμένος, προκατάρτισης. Πρώτο στάδιο εκμαθήσεως. Εγώ τουλάχιστον έτσι το καταλαβαίνω. Το προκατάστασης είναι λάθος της έκθεσης.
Any other questions?
Ναι, πού το είδες, παιδί.
Ήταν πιο μεγάλο πριν. Κάποια άλλη διαφάνεια. Πιάσατε το λάθος τώρα της έκδοσης.
Is there any other question? So we can just go on and see the questions in the Zoom. So should I read them? That's the first one. Marios, do you listen? How do you justify the division of Greek modern civil law into general principles, property law, etc., being identical to the Hexabiblos one?
The Greek civil law is based on German civil law, of course, but the most interesting will be that why the German civil law of the 19th follows the structure of Hexabiblos. And of course, our civil code is not a copy of the German code and has been influenced by Hexabiblos, that's clear. Also in the internal division of the subjects. I mean, not only the division of the 5 books.
Yes, perhaps it was inspired by the European models, the Western European models.
Yes.
And a second question by Kyriakos Nikias, who is in Vienna. He writes, "Thank you for the interesting presentation. May I ask, what is the state and distribution of the documentary evidence for the application of the Hexabiblos in Greece, especially in the 15th to 18th centuries. I'm wondering about whether there are attested references in official documents, judicial decisions, or maybe private transactions, etc.
There are many. I mean, in the 15th century,
From the 15th to the 18th
from
century.
the Patriarchate uses Hexabiblos. I think this is and also there are many manuscripts that have commentaries. So we can see that the manuscripts of the Hexabiblos belonged mostly to judges. So when we see commentaries on these manuscripts, and but many of them have not been edited, we can deduce that it was used. I mean, they used the text of Hexabiblos for their judicial duties.
Okay. I just to extend a bit the question. Are there patterns in the way the manuscripts are spread in the Greek peninsula? I mean, there are concentrating in urban centers or in bishoprics, in the seat of a bishop, or anything like that.
It's difficult because one has to originate. I mean, it could be a case that the manuscript now is found in Peloponnesus, for example, but it originates from Epirus. Or it's not easy task to see to detect the origin of its manuscript. What is beyond doubt is that in Peloponnesus, Hexabiblos seems to have quite to be very popular, at least in the 18th century and even earlier, I would say.
Dr. Apostolopoulos, a question?
Πρώτα θέλω να συγχαρώ τον συνάδελφο του φίλου κύριο Μάριο Τάνταλο για την εμπειριστατωμένη ανακοίνωσή του που μας παρουσίασε την ιστορία της Hexabiblos και τις εκδόσεις που γνώρισε. Επιτρέψτε μου να μείνω λίγο στην μεταβυζαντινή περίοδο και τη χρήση της Hexabiblos, γιατί νομίζω ότι έχει τη σημασία της και να δικαιολογήσει και την δημόδη απόδοσή της. Αμέσως μετά την άλωση, ο πρώτος μετά την άλωση πατριάρχης βγάζει μια επίσημη εγκύκλιο, δεν είναι ένα κάτι που το ναι, έλεγα ότι ο πρώτος μετά την άλωση βγάζει μια εγκύκλιο επίσημη, στην οποία αναφέρει ότι έτσι που ήρθαν τα πράγματα μετά τα γεγονότα της Ρώσιας, οι χριστιανοί πρέπει να ακολουθούν τους θείους νόμους του Ευαγγελίου και τους κρατήσαντες νόμους στην ευσεβεστάτη πολιτεία των Βυζαντινών. Αυτό νομίζω σημαίνει ότι ο Βυζαντινός νόμος δεν ήταν κάτι παράνομο, είχε γίνει δεκτός και από τη νέα εξουσία της Ανατολής. Και από εκεί ύστερα άρχισαν τα προβλήματα. Πόσοι άνθρωποι θα μπορούσαν να κατανοήσουν ένα κείμενο το οποίο ήταν γραμμένο σε μια λόγια γλώσσα. Και νομίζω ότι από εκεί προέκυψε η ανάγκη να αποδοθεί το κείμενο στη δημόδια και μέσα από την δημόδια αυτή απόδοσή του έχουμε, όπως πολύ καλά γνωρίζετε, μερικές ενδείξεις για το τι ίσχυε την εποχή που γίνεται η απόδοση του βυζαντινού κειμένου στην δημόδια. Περνάνε δηλαδή εμέσως κάποιες διατάξεις, κάποιες αλλαγές που έχουν επέλθει στο κείμενο για να βοηθήσουν τον άνθρωπο που αποδίδει το δίκαιο ή που θέλει να είναι ενημερωμένος για θέματα του δικαίου. ίσως φλιάρισα, αλλά ήθελα να πω τη σημασία της αποδόσεως της Hexabiblos στη Δημόσια.
Oh, thank you very much for your comment.
We have a comment from Professor Van Bochelen. Thank you for your very clear and illuminating presentation that taught me the many new insights into the history of the Hexabiblos, especially in Western Europe. Okay. Any other questions?
Αν δεν υπάρχει κάποιος άλλος. Θα ήθελα να επιστήσω την προσοχή γενικότερα σε κάτι το οποίο τουλάχιστον εγώ βρήκα ενδιαφέρον στη μετάφραση, μιας και μπήκαμε στις μεταφράσεις, στη μετάφραση όχι του Σπανού, την προηγούμενη αυτή με τα πολλά λαϊκά στοιχεία, σε κάποιο σημείο που μιλάει για κοινωνία, έτσι μπράβο, ναι, λέει συνίσταται κοινωνία, το κείμενο της Hexabiblos χρησιμοποιεί τον όρο κοινωνία, που είναι ο βυζαντινός όρος, ο οποίος σιγά σιγά περιλαμβάνει και την εταιρεία. Εδώ που έχουμε τη μετάφραση, τη μεταγενέστερη, λέει συσταίνεται κοινωνία και συντροφιά, όπου ο όρος συντροφία και αργότερα συντροφιά είναι ο όρος που δηλώνει την εταιρεία. Και δείχνει ότι αυτός καταλαβαίνει τι περιέχει ο όρος τον οποίο προσπαθεί να μεταφράσει και τον αιτιολογεί και με τη σύγχρονη λέξη. Και το βρήκα τουλάχιστον εγώ ενδιαφέρον. Και το κοντιτσιόν κάτω, γιατί είναι αυτό που έχουμε στις κυκλάδες, στις κοντιτζιόνες, στις περιουσίες κτλ. Δηλαδή, η παράφραση αυτή έχει ένα αρκετό ενδιαφέρον.
Yes, it's very interesting. But I mean, I don't think that it's a coincidence that he uses condition to and condizione.
Yes, because there is
The condition, the Latin text, yes.
The Latin text is syntropia.
Yes, of course.
Is something new and something Byzantine and post-Byzantine.
Anyone else? Yes, the question? I think this should be the last one, okay?
It's actually the opposite of the question of Kyriakou Nikias. After the Hexabiblos, in the decisions, etc., do we have any reference to the original text on which the Hexabiblos was based, or are they completely replaced by the Hexabiblos, as it was a very handy and short book?
I don't remember. I cannot recall any other. It might be, but mostly they used Hexabiblos. Yes. And it was difficult to find in the post-Byzantine period other books. Yes, it wasn't not even close. Okay.
Okay, I would like to thank the speaker, Dr. Marios Tantalos. I'd like to thank you for your patience and the questions, and we would like to invite you to a glass of wine upstairs. Thank you.